Supply and Chain podcasts. We are your hosts, Leo and Kristine.
We are so excited to welcome Ivan to our episode today. He's ex-military turned development economist and part of Rascal Republic private equity and debt fundraising team. He's also a fellow entrepreneur who is absolutely obsessed with lettercraft. We're so excited to have you here, Ivan. Hi, Ivan. We're super excited to welcome you today on the podcast. So we would love to hear from the private equity and entrepreneur side from you.
Great.
Yeah. So do you believe it's possible to achieve 100% connectivity across fashion value chain?
Well, so I guess the short answer is yes, right? And I think it's possible, and I think we're already seeing that in many ways. But a long answer is that I think it depends on really what you mean by connectivity across the value chain, and more importantly, I think why you think that connectivity is important. I think one of the important things to note is not just the connectivity that is between the sort of like the factories and the brands, but it's also between the brands and people, right? So there's that level of connectivity that runs throughout the entire value chain, and I think that's enabling us to connect a little bit more. So like things like sourcing, procurement, quality control, all of those elements of supply chain management are much easier to handle today than ever before. Especially with the coronavirus, we're starting to see how that really does come in play. And you can see in Singapore, for instance, a lot of the fashion brands that we know, at least in our context, like Love Bonito, the ones that have grown really big, really all started out as these blog shops that were sourcing from like places like Seoul, like Bangkok, these wholesale centers, and they were just reselling basically fashion pieces. You're starting to see a lot more integration across the procurement chain. Factories are able to talk to each other as well, so that enables them to kind of source for things that they can't do themselves. But in terms of some of the issues that I think you're still seeing with fashion supply chains today, and this is not necessarily related to how interconnected they are, but they're still very inefficient. But I think that has to do with more of the business model of fashion. What we're seeing is that the fact that brands operate on this fast fashion model, you don't have a lot of integration in that sense, at least in terms of the incentive structure. So you still have a lot of overstock. You've got massive amounts of warehouses that are warehouses full of stock that's produced and it's never going to be sold, right? So I don't think that integration necessarily will address that. It's more of a business model issue with fast fashion.
Which do you think is your favorite myth in the fashion supply chain?
So I think people don't really understand how broken fashion supply chains are. Most people think that, in an era where we have like, machine learning, AI, predictive analytics, demand forecasting, even with things like Excel, right? So, I mean, a funny story is that when I applied to work in Charles & Keith, which is partially owned by LVMH, when I just came out of high school. And back then there were already positions for like demand forecasting, right? Like these people who would crunch, the sales figures on their Excel sheets, and they would try to kind of accurately forecast what next season sales were going to be, which colors were popular, which sizes were popular, and then those that were not popular were going to get axed. But there's still a massive amount of overstock.
Pretty much the way every brand or every retailer is dealing with their apparel business. And really that's what maybe COVID has really emphasized, is that now you have all your stock, all your money tied in stock, or old models you have to get rid of, and now you just don't have cash flow.
Exactly. And I think I like this idea of, when Kristine, you mentioned the value chain rather than just the supply chain, because I think it is a value chain problem, right? Because retailers, right? I mean, well, at least for the high street brands, right? You have a lot of power concentrated in the hands of retailers, which is mind-boggling in the era of e-commerce, right? So like these retailers are the ones that ultimately tell the brands what to produce next season, and just like making slight tweaks to the SKUs and the inventory just so that they can claim exclusivity. But it's meaningless, right? And a lot of these brands, like in the current pandemic that we're seeing, the moment that the retailers can't take orders, like it's all on consignment, right? So you just have to take back your stock.
So they are the ones dictating
That's right.
without any liability or responsibility on their
Yeah.
bad decisions, which is
Zero.
totally different. If you were taking the risk, will you be, how will you plan versus like, oh, if it sells, it sells. If it doesn't,
Exactly.
well, oops.
Yep, it's not my problem, right? So you're right, and I love that analysis because it's really about the alignment of incentives, right? Show me the incentives, and I'll show you the outcome. And right now, the retailers have zero incentive to manage the inventory.
I know, Ivan, you are a big fan of like on-demand manufacturing. Do you see that would solve the problem?
Yes, I'm as you know, I'm a huge fan of on-demand manufacturing. I think that is one of the solutions to the problem. But see, the thing with on-demand manufacturing is that a lot of people see that as basically something that factories have to adopt, right? It's not a factory thing. On-demand manufacturing has to do with a business model. So, and that's why it's important to talk about the value chain, because on-demand manufacturing is not a supply chain innovation as much as it is a business model innovation. Yeah.
What do you see as the most innovative recent fashion supply chain initiative project? Maybe you would like to share something on-demand related.
I think you're going to see in general a broad trend where you will have brands that have three different qualities, I think, that stand out to me. One is that you're going to see brands that are more direct to consumer, right? So they're not going to rely on these like third-party retailers as much. You're going to see them have mass personalization as a bigger part of their, well, not entirely their lineup, right? But it's going to be a bigger part of it. That's where you have your on-demand manufacturing or made-to-order manufacturing. So, and I think digital technologies are absolutely a big part of that. And a great example of one company, they're not new, right? But I think they epitomize sort of like this ideal of what the future is going to look like for fashion is Zara, right? They are highly vertically integrated, right? They own the factories, the logistics even, right? So during the coronavirus, they didn't rely on third-party logistics, which were hit. They literally sent their own planes to ship their own stuff. Right. And even the retail stores, right? So Zara owns like most, if not all of the retail stores. Or if they don't own it fully, then they have at least have majority control as to like, whether the stores stay open or not. So, and you see that in the COVID-19 pandemic, where Zara was able to basically shutter all of its stores very, very quickly. Now, some people might see that as a bad sign, but no, that's evidence of the fact that Zara is incredibly in control of the value chain, right? It's very responsive. It doesn't have to incur these overheads if it doesn't need to, and it can respond very quickly to market conditions in a way that other people can't, because you sign these long-term leases with the landlords and the retailers and things like that. But Zara can just say tomorrow, like, nope, you know what, there's money going down the drain, I'm going to cut it. So I think that's a good example of the future of fashion supply chains or business models in general.
But how do you see that on the other side of having the post-COVID, as you're saying, having more control of your value chain? And we will end up, on the other hand, with just big companies getting bigger, and and smaller companies just being acquired by the survivors of the pandemic. Because you're saying, we need to have more control of our value chain, meaning we need to, whatever we used to outsource or rely on our partners, now we want to do it ourselves in-house. And it's really going to become a matter of who is the bigger player left post-apocalypse.
Yes, that's right. So I think that if you're doing things the way that it's always been done, so if you're operating like a traditional fashion business, you've got all these seasons to design for, you're going through large retail stores, you're screwed. There's no way to put it. You're right. You are going to be, you're either going to shut down, or if you've got some value left, and that's what we're seeing on the high street all across the world, whether it's London or New York or Paris. You look at LVMH, right? LVMH is a financial group. Like, let's make no mistake about it. Like, for example, Louis Vuitton wasn't a fantastic business. It was on the verge of financial ruin, and it was basically bought out by a real estate mogul, right? Bernard Arnault, right? So it's a business at the end of the day, So I think that if you operate along the traditional model, times are going to be really, really bad. But the flip side of that is that if you're a startup, and you're considering going into fashion, I'd say that you really have to think very long and hard about what kind of business model you want to adopt going forward into the future, because we are not going to go back to a post-COVID world as much as a lot of people wish and hope that it is not. And it's not just because and it's not just because the virus is still out there.
Yeah.
Even if the virus goes away, even if we develop a vaccine for it, which within the next 4 years, which is still a very long time, um, I think people's behavior will have changed, right? Their willingness to go out and shop on the high street is going to change, except for the luxury brands.
Yeah.
For a vast majority of fashion, people's tastes, preferences, norms, behaviors, all of that's going to change, and that will drastically affect how you run your business. So, and that's what it kind of goes back to what I said, right? I think that the way to go forward, if you are a new brand, is direct to consumer. You want to have some element of mass personalization, and you want to find a business model that translates to a very, very lean supply chain, either with on-demand manufacturing or sort of like customization, where there's very little chance for your unsold inventory to go out of season, or you can repurpose it for another season. I think that's some of the directions that young startups can go in, and I think you've got great examples of that. So, in for example, in the bags space, you've got companies like Monpurse, right, who make their handbags entirely customized and it's on demand. Print on demand companies like Printful, Society 6, like Threadless, the kinds that print the sofa covers, the t-shirts, mugs and stuff like that, right? They are $100 million business, right? And they run on this model. They're direct to consumer. They have no physical stores mostly. And again, right, it's all flexible manufacturing. Look beyond, right, like what the fashion media traditionally reports on, right? Look at what people are buying. Look at where consumer trends are headed. And I think you'll still see that, hey, there are $100 million companies born, and I don't think that's a small number at all. There are two approaches that private equity typically takes, right? So one is the traditional private equity, which is buyouts or distressed asset, which is what's happening with most of fashion, right? Like all these brands like Dorothy Perkins and all that, they are not surviving. They are getting basically bought out at incredibly cheap prices. They are basically offered rescue packages to say that, look, your alternative is to either collapse and go under and stop existing, or you let me take control of your company for a very, very cheap price. And what I do is that I try to turn it around, right? So that's the high street model of private equity and how it relates to fashion. But the other model is really venture capital, right? So we look at companies who are starting from scratch, but have a very innovative business model, and we say that's the future. And I'm not going to try to revive a dead corpse, right? I'm going to try to invest in a newborn and like raise a new child, sort of. So I think those are the two ways to think about private equity and how it relates to fashion.
How would you deal with the Dorothy Perkins? Would you try to digitalize the assets, the operations, or rather work on a brand asset and try to merge with them with other brand?
Private equity has kind of gained a bit of a bad name, right? Especially in America, because what they do is that they go in there, they aggressively cut costs. They slash all the things that are unnecessary, and some of the things that you might consider necessary, right? So they cut headcount drastically. They reduce spending on non-key areas like staff welfare and all that sort of thing, and they drop a lot of these extra programs so they can get the balance sheets to look good, right? And then either they sell it off really quickly to someone else who can do a better job, or they kind of construct a portfolio of brands, which is typically what some of the larger private equity firms do, right? They put it all together in this large portfolio, kind of like what LVMH did for luxury, and then they try to sell off the whole portfolio as like, okay, this is a fast fashion portfolio or something like that. So I don't think there's too much of the active intervention to actually improve the business, unfortunately, with things like digitalization, because it's very challenging. It's very, very challenging to revive a company that is struggling, especially within a short amount of time.
To change gears a little bit, let's reflect a little bit on your career and your experience. And maybe you can share with our viewers and listeners based on your biggest failure or challenge, what were your main learnings?
Mm. Well, so I mean, thankfully, I can say that I haven't at least failed in a big way, right? But I think that I've been able to learn from some of the observations of the fashion industry, kind of watching as an outsider, especially during the pandemic.
Hmm.
So I think for me, the main takeaway is to build a fashion brand that is really run on a completely different business model from the way that things are done currently. With whatever we're talking about right now, with the death of high street, and how fashion is really struggling to survive in this COVID period. um, so I think direct to consumer, mass personalization, made to order manufacturing, those are the major takeaways that I would learn. So I basically looked at all these other fashion brands that are struggling and said, okay, what's wrong with the business model and what do you have to do right? You know, so if mass production, if like manufacturing for seasons is the problem,
Yeah.
then naturally, sort of the conclusion is that look, I shouldn't be doing those things. I should be going direct to consumer to cut out the retailers wherever possible. I should be manufacturing on demand as much as possible, right? So, but I still don't see that translating yet in a big way, right, to most of the fashion industry.
These things that you're mentioning are
Yeah.
not new. Like
No,
all these concepts, these technologies are
no.
not the future. These
Yeah,
are things that we've been talking for years. And as you
that's
were
right.
saying before, the companies that are surviving this pandemic, that which again no one saw coming, were
Yes.
the ones who were adapting and trying new things and kind of moving on from the traditional point of view, which in the
Yeah.
fashion sense as well, you have a lot of, because it's not just engineering, it's not a technical side, but also there's the artistry, the handcraft, and it's really an industry that was fighting its way, fighting to receive any technology or any or touching the traditions.
Yeah.
But now the situation that we're all living in is
Mhm.
really, like poking holes in all those logics and all those traditions
Yeah.
that other companies have decided, hey, we don't need to if you say, if I'm starting a company today, we'll start with a similar process to companies that we created 100 years ago. I don't think so.
Mhm.
You start thinking with the current mindset, and you start
Yeah.
putting your value chain and your position model based on technology and based on how I can get to know my customer better, how do I commit less on stock. But traditional companies were still producing, as you said, 1 year before for one season that you know will be sold in a retailer, and hopefully that will sell, and
Yeah,
then we
you
will
hope
make
it
some.
sells.
And then boom, a pandemic hits, and then you have like
Yeah.
such a long 9 month value chain. And I'm developing a new season that we don't even know if stores will be open, and we have warehouses full of product for the next 2 months
Yeah.
that the stores will be closed, and the whole system collapsed. It was too slow and too big. But and
Yeah.
yeah, these concepts that are new for a lot of companies, they're not new at all in the industry. Like, people have been doing
That's
it
right.
for years.
But so I think the difference is that, just to kind of touch on that a little bit more, is that the previous recessions that we've seen have largely been financial, have originated in the financial sector, right? So in economics, we always make a distinction between the financial markets and also the real economy, right? And this is the first recession in a very long time that has originated in the real economy, right? So in, say, for example, the 1990s, you had the dot-com bubble that was
Mhm.
originated in the financial markets. In
Yeah.
1997, you got the Asian financial crisis, which is really in the forex markets. And then you have the 2008, 2009.
Mhm.
That's where it started to kind of hit a little bit more on the real economy with real estate and things like that. But still, it, again, originated in the financial sector in derivatives, right? But in today's case, right, with COVID 19, you have a recession that's triggered not by the trade war,
Mhm.
not by all these other, not by a financial crash, but you have it starting in the real economy, in the real world, with basically people not going out and spending because of the pandemic, right? So I think that's the first time that retailers and the entire business model basically is being challenged fundamentally, because previously they'll be like, okay, you know what, let's ride this out. We hunker down, take our losses for 6 months, 12 months, and we know the financial markets will recover as they always have and come back stronger.
Yeah.
But now it's totally different, and that's where I think you're going to start to see people really question the business model a little bit more. But because, like you said, none of this was new. I think they just never had an incentive to listen.
How do you actually learn and stay on things, understanding that this is new era? And do you try to look into different industries? What's your way?
So I think one of the things that really does help is that I don't have a fashion background. Because I mean, I think that being an insider, you I guess it comes with benefits in the sense that you understand the industry better, but also you kind of don't see alternatives as well. You kind of pick up a lot of the baggage about the norms and the values and the way things are done in the industry, and you can't see beyond that. And I think coming from that different background really means that I don't carry all that mental baggage of the fashion industry, and that allows me really to kind of look at other different sources of inspiration, different business models, right? Keep my eye on the horizon a little bit. I think making time for learning outside of that circle of competence and what your comfort zone is, especially in your day job, right? Like learn how financial markets work. Listen to a lecture on artificial intelligence or machine learning, take a course in digital marketing. Just jump into a different field, right? Even if it's like reading industry reports on like additive manufacturing. I think it takes that curiosity to go beyond your industry and kind of draw those lessons back to your own sector.
Many of these concepts have been successfully applied for now decades in different industries.
That's right.
And again, you don't have to be the one that tries to adapt something that has been used in the automobile industry, or building a ship and trying to, that's too complex. It's true, but again, if you look at different, I gave the example the other day, between music and fashion, they're also very artistry, very out of imagination and talent. But how the whole industry has changed and everything is digital. Like even the product you buy nowadays is not a physical product. You actually buy a digital product. Like the whole supply chain is digital. So we see a lot of buy pressure. And again, this is driven because people were not buying discs anymore. So everything is driven and they adapt. But for some reason, fashion, we're like, no, we're traditional. People want us because we own our own cows or whatever it is. And we take 2 years to make a product. But that's not a good business. You can still have like a small brand that sells 100 products a year, but if you really want to grow and in this case survive, you need to adapt.
Again, right? I think for the last few decades, nothing serious has hit fashion this bad. And like with you raised the example of the music industry, right? HMV, right? And all these other players were still saying that, it's a fad, right? Like digital music is a fad. People still want to come down to stores and buy CDs. And and you just think about how ridiculous that sounds now when you've got Spotify, or you've got Netflix and all this sort of thing. But those people still hunker down, right? So I think you're going to get a lot more resistance if you're within the industry. So I would say that if you want to really adopt a new business model, you've got to find people who believe in that, and they're like, okay, we have to start something, and if it means going outside of the traditional fashion industry, then that's what's going to happen.
Cool. It's excellent advice. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you for having me. One of the major fashion trends that I think is going to come out of this pandemic is the fact that people are gonna just wear it more casually. Like I was putting on my dress shoes the other day and I was like, damn, like it's tight.